Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Nope.
Good morning, everyone. Well, last lecture, I just screwed up. I blew the lecture, and we're not going backwards. The way I'm dealing with this, first of all, if there's a problem in this electronic communication, please somebody call me at 583-5497. My cell phone is sitting by the computer, and that would be the way in which we could ensure communication. The way we're going to deal with that problem is by falling back on the review questions. Now, remember what I said about the review question. The review questions are the basis of the final examination, the end of the term, take-home examination. So if we focus initially on the review questions, I'm going to try and do two of them today. It's a way in which I can incorporate some of the material from the last lost lecture, which I say, despite the fact that I stupidly didn't turn on the unmute, was a very good lecture, but it's lost. So we're going to do with the review questions. Are there any things you want to raise at this point? Okay. So remember, we did the first review question about civilization. So I want to begin today discussing why was the fall of Constantinople in 1453 a significant event? And that covers a fair amount of the material from last lecture. So why was the fall of Constantinople in 1453 important? Well, the fall of Constantinople, what are we referring to? We're referring to the fact that Constantinople, which was a Christian city and had been right through the Middle Ages. It was founded by the Emperor Constantine way back in, I believe, 323. And it became the capital of what in the Middle Ages was called the East Roman or Byzantine Empire. And it withstood many sieges, particularly from the Islamic world. The Arabs repeatedly besieged Constantinople. Well, finally, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire, which was arising throughout the Middle East, under the leadership of its Sultan Mehmed II, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, the last Christian outpost in the Middle East, which had stood for so many centuries. And symbolically, that was a very important event. Certainly, the West Europeans were very alarmed. It raised the possibility, which in some ways was real, that this newly strong Ottoman Muslim power could invade Europe. It was organizing itself. This was a great triumph. And part of its, just like the Europeans had this idea of crusading against infidels, crusading against Islam, the Ottomans, being Muslims, they believed in the jihad, that is to say, wars of conquest against the infidels, namely the Christians. So the Christians and the Muslims had much the same idea. So the immediate effect of all this was that the Ottoman Empire basically closed off the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, to traffic from Western Europe, these Christians. At first, they would have nothing to do with it. that meant the suspension of European trade with India and Asia. All of the spices and luxury goods, they were not available. And so this closing of the Mediterranean, it didn't last more than 20 years because the Ottomans soon came to their senses and they realized that the traffic between Europeans and Asia, which ran right across their territory, was extremely lucrative, absolutely fundamental to the revenues of the Sultan. And so the trade was, by about 1475, was reopened. But meanwhile, the West Europeans, and in particular the Portuguese, and here we come to the point, the Portuguese state, which was of course part of the Iberian Peninsula alongside Spain, had developed as a result of crusading against the Muslims, especially in North Africa. And so the Portuguese, in order to reopen a route to Asia, decided, particularly the royal court, led by an individual by the name of Prince Henry, my name, decided to launch a series of voyages down the West African coast to try and, by means of an all-water route, reach India. In other words, from Portugal, successively, Portuguese vessels, merchant and war vessels, made their way around down the West African coast, and as we'll see, ultimately they reached India. Now, along the way, as they were going, they founded all sorts of sort of forts, which were both military outposts and places where trading went on, as, for example, we see in Manitoba, the Fort Garry. Both had that characteristic. It was a fort, but it was also a trading post, and that's the way the Portuguese proceeded. Well, one of the key things they did was in Africa, there was a slave trade. It wasn't that developed. But the Portuguese began to develop the slave trade, and they took, by 1500, they bought some 150,000 black slaves, and they installed them on the islands like the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands, San Tome. I'm just naming these islands offshore from West Africa. And there the Portuguese set up sugar plantations. Because sugar was a new commodity, and enormous profits could be made in Europe by selling, by basically raising sugarcane and selling it to European buyers. There was a craze for sugar, 7-Eleven sort of phenomenon. Well, these slave plantations, which were originally developed offshore by the Portuguese, they ultimately developed them on a much greater scale in Brazil. Brazil became a vast sugar plantation, the coast of Brazil, and the Portuguese developed this slave sugar plantation economy, and ultimately this kind of exploitation, if you like, developed in the Caribbean and places like Cuba and Haiti, Santo Domingo, Guadeloupe, and of course, I'm now talking about the 17th and 18th century. It was a source of vast riches for, first of all, Portugal and then the Europeans. So that's important in itself. But moving beyond that, of course, is the fact that these voyages, and of course they were made in these new ships that I described in previous lecture, in these sailing vessels, ultimately an individual by the name of Diaz there you go. First of all, note at the top, that's my cell phone number in case we run into problems. But here's his name, Bartholomew Diaz. B. Diaz was his name. He was a Portuguese sea captain, and he sailed his ship around the tip of South Africa, which is the Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean. He proved that it was possible to enter the Indian Ocean using this South Atlantic route. This was in 1488. 10 years later, a second Portuguese sea captain by the name of Vasco da Gama repeated the feat of Diaz, but he actually sailed to the Indian coast in 1498. This happened. Along the way, in 1500, we note that Cabral discovered Brazil in 1500. Now, this Vasco da Gama established the Portuguese. There was a lot of fighting with Indian merchants, with actually Ottoman merchants, even with the Venetians, because obviously the Portuguese were intruding on the Mediterranean sort of Near Eastern route to the Far East. So there was a lot of rivalry. And Vasco da Gama, he had a fleet of powerful warships, cannon, and so on. And the Portuguese were able to establish themselves on the West Indian coast, the Malabar coast, at a place called Goa. And that became the capital of their empire in the Far East. And the Portuguese then went on to establish forts, some 50 forts all over Asia to control the trade of Asia. So all of this was extremely important because it was by this means that, in fact, the Portuguese had basically established an all-water route to India. And this route proved, although it took time, it was only in 1580 that this Atlantic route to the Far East really fully developed. The Mediterranean route held on for some decades until 1580, but by 1580, the Atlantic route had triumphed. And this meant basically the unification of world commerce. That's the basic thing that the Portuguese succeeded in. They unified, and it made it possible, given the size of these European ships, to actually enormously expand the volume of commerce. Remember, I said earlier that yes, there was commerce before across Eurasia, but it was a trickle. But this South Atlantic route, now you have really the unification of world commerce. So that's all very important. So that's basically the answer. This, of course, is all recorded, and this is the answer to the second question. So are there any things that this little discussion raises for you that you wish clarification for? You see, I'm trying to make up the ground. Now, Having dealt a little bit with Portugal, there's a little bit more to say. I would say that the Portuguese, in conclusion, with respect to the Portuguese, the problem for the Portuguese was that their population was small. Portugal it had less than 1 million people. And the merchant class was small. And Portugal didn't manufacture many things, nothing that the Asians wanted. And so as a result of all that, the Portuguese, for example, in order to sort of deal with their situation, very early they had to enter into partnership with merchants and bankers from Germany, because at this moment we're talking at the beginning of the 16th century, Germany was the center of the emerging capitalism. There were very rich German bankers and German manufacturing, including the arms industry, but also the textile industry. They produced stuff, and I might note also clocks and watches, that the Asians actually wanted. At least the Asians would buy arms and clocks from the Europeans. So this is what the Portuguese began to sell in Africa and eventually to the Indians. But the point is that from a financial point of view, the Germans, basically behind the Portuguese, were German capitalists. That's one example. Second, the Portuguese, they didn't have enough manpower to man 50 forts in Asia. And so, for example, at Goa, which was the capital of their empire, they began to intermarry with some of the more elite Indian merchants. There were, in and around Goa, well, of course, India was, the social system there was based on castes, where we'll deal with castes when we deal with India. There were certain high castes, that is to say, more or less aristocratic merchant class, castes. And so the Portuguese merchants intermarried with the Indian high caste merchants. And Goa sort of emerged as a kind of Indian Catholic Portuguese enclave, and a kind of sort of interesting sort of Indian sort of Portuguese Catholicism developed at Goa and various other places along the West Coast. That's interesting in itself. And a third example of, I would say, the weakness of the Portuguese was their merchant class was weak. And so the Portuguese had to turn to the Jews to become their merchant class. But it happened in a peculiar way, because in 1492, the Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews, were expelled from Spain. And I'll deal with that a little bit later in this lecture, because they were not Catholics. And the new Spanish monarchy, as part of their ideology and so on, and was to get rid of the Muslims and the Jews in Spain who had been living there through the Middle Ages. Anybody who wanted to remain in Spain had to become a Catholic. Many Jews refused, and they fled to Portugal, several hundred thousand. Well, in 1497, the Portuguese king, his name was Manuel, decided that what the Spanish had done was a good thing. And so in 1497, he tells the Jews, convert or you have to leave. Most of the Jews left, but about 120,000 of them converted to Catholicism. And they became the new middle class in Portugal. they supplemented whoever the Portuguese merchants were, and particularly these Jews, many of whom were secretly continued to practice Judaism. They were ostensibly Catholics, but they remained secretly Jews. These people were known as conversos, the converted ones. And they became a kind of important part of the middle class that operated the Portuguese Empire in Africa, especially, and in Brazil and the Caribbean. So that's the end of that discussion of Portugal for now. I want now, are there any questions about this? Okay, I want now to turn to Spain. I wanted to talk about the development of the Spanish Empire. And of course, Portugal, though we don't know anything, we know very little about it because in the English-speaking world, there's little sense of this. Portugal did develop in Africa and especially in Brazil. There was a kind of fusion of it's sort of African and indigenous and Portuguese culture. In Brazil, which is the largest country in Latin America, is partly of sort of Portuguese culture. Portuguese is the language. And there's a whole culture, the whole reality that, of course, we can't really delve into to any great extent. So let's turn to the Spanish Empire. And of course, here we're dealing with a political and a cultural entity which is far greater than Portugal. And whereas Portugal we can describe it as a maritime empire, or to use the technical term, a maritime empire based on merchants. There were so few people. Essentially, it was the merchants who ran the Portuguese Empire. We call this kind of entity thalassocracy, which literally translates as maritime empire, based on merchants. Of course, with the support of the Portuguese state, but nevertheless, it's a thalos in Greece means sea. So ruled by the sea, maritime empire. But the Spanish Empire was a land-based empire. And most of Latin America was swallowed up by the Spaniards as a result. And this became the basis of a Spanish Empire that lasted until well into the 19th century. And of course, Latin America, the language for the most part is Spanish, the culture, and the religion is a kind of Spanish culture. And so it's extremely important in terms of understanding not merely the past, but of course the present as well. So with that, let's delve into this. Now Portugal had discovered its empire by sailing south down the west coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean and ultimately to India. In contrast, Spain looked directly across the Atlantic. Spain, the Spanish sort of geographers, and in particular, he was an Italian, Columbus, from Genoa, which is this important northern Italian port. He came to the Spanish court. He came to the court of Spain, which was in Madrid, and there the ruling monarchs were a couple, a power couple, Ferdinand and Isabella. I'm sure you've heard of this, Ferdinand and Isabella. And basically, he argued, and some in the Spanish court, scholars and so on, supported him, that if instead of the Portuguese sailing south, one sailed due west, one would reach India. There was this vast ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, but if you persisted, and that belief was reinforced by the idea that the world, geographers understood that the world was round. There's some sort of idea that these people at that time actually believed that the world was flat. That may have been true way back during the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and so on. But by 1500, everybody understood. By 1492, the world was round. But they mistakenly believed that the circumference of the Earth, the size of the Earth, was relatively limited. So Columbus said, "Well, we'll sail due west, and we'll strike India." Now, Columbus was this sea captain, but you should understand that Columbus wasn't acting independently. No, behind Columbus were these Italian or Genoa. It's still an important port in northern Italy. There were very rich merchants and bankers. There was a syndicate of Genoese bankers who are actually the backers, the financial backers of Columbus. And as a matter of fact, the Ferdinand and Isabella's backing Columbus was the beginning of a relationship between the Spanish crown and these Genoese bankers, who became basically the financial officials and the bankers of the Spanish monarchy, And this is very important in sort of explaining the developing power of the Spanish Empire, because of course it was a political and military power, but behind that was the financial power of these Genoese Italian bankers. So it was, this partnership emerged, and of course, Columbus set sail in 1492. And of course, the first place he came to was essentially what is today Haiti, or Dominica, Haiti, and Cuba. This is where he arrived. He thought at first, well, I've reached India. Well, of course, what he had reached was the Americas. Now, we do have the journal of Columbus, what he thought of all of this. And what we find is, of course, Columbus being an ardent Catholic and so on, so too the others on the voyage, they immediately had in mind the conversion of the natives to Catholicism. That was the sort of ideological framework. In terms of history, there's always, whatever the other motives, there is always an ideology. People have an ideology, especially states, justifying their political ambitions. And the ideology of Columbus and of the Spanish was Roman Catholicism, a crusading Roman Catholicism. And I want to emphasize that. Crusade, conversion, the spread of Christianity. The Ottomans had theirs. The West Europeans, it was all about from an ideological point of view. But if you look at his journal, again and again, it's the lust for gold. Where's the money? Where's the gold is what he's after. And this is, I'll elaborate on that. It's a very important point. Columbus is seeking, of course, he wants to get to India to get a hold of the spices and luxury, but there's this constant awareness. The need to get a hold of gold is critical. I'll develop that in a few minutes. So that's, and I'll talk about the consequences of this for the Caribbean in a few minutes. But I want to sort of move on and sort of talk about the development of the Spanish Empire. So what we want to note following the voyages of Columbus is the voyage of Magellan. His name was Ferdinand Magellan, and his voyage began in 1521. Now, Magellan actually was Portuguese, but he fell into an argument with the Portuguese king, and so he left Lisbon and he traveled to Madrid, the Spanish capital, and offered his services to the Spanish crown. And the Spanish crown backed him. 5 ships, 5 highly seaworthy ocean-going vessels were brought together, and they set sail in hopes of, because there was, following Columbus, a certain sense of geography. If Magellan sailed not simply due south, but southwest across the Atlantic, along the Atlantic coast of the Americas, of Latin America, that he could round what is called the Cape Horn, which is located in Chile and Argentina today. We have the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa. We have Cape Horn at the bottom of Latin America, and he could enter the Pacific Ocean, and that's exactly what he did in 1521. Magellan rounds the Cape of Good Hope and enters the Pacific Ocean, and he crosses with his 5 ships and lands in the Philippine Islands. And ultimately, Magellan is killed fighting the indigenous people of the Philippines, and only 1 ship actually makes it back to Europe. But that ship is filled with spices, and it means that it is possible for the Spaniards in rivalry to the Portuguese to reach across the Pacific to China and India. And that's the first thing to say is, well, Magellan demonstrates the true and very large dimensions of the Earth. The Earth is much larger than people realize. Nevertheless, at the same time, he shows that it is possible to develop an ocean-going trade via the Americas to China and India. So that's the consequence of Magellan's voyage. Now we should note that Magellan himself was killed. The Spaniards, when they landed in the Philippines, they said, "We now claim this land for the Spanish monarchy," and they named these islands the Philippine Islands, after the son of the then reigning king of Spain, the Philippine Islands. Now, there in the Philippines, the great majority of people were what we call Tagalog-speaking people. Of course, we have 100,000 and more Filipino people living in Winnipeg. But also there in the Philippines, and the established elite was a class of merchants from China. Chinese merchants were trading with the Philippine Islands since the 12th century, and they were the ruling elite in the Philippines. Well, the Spaniards fought a series of battles with these Chinese, and they defeated the Chinese merchants, and they established themselves as basically politically in the Philippines. And that became the Spaniards' main base in the Pacific. Manila became the main base. And it was via Manila that from Mexico and Central America, the Spaniards they didn't use the southern route because it was too difficult and too long. No, the Spanish trade developed out of Mexico, because in Mexico there were vast amounts of silver, and they could bring this silver to the Philippines and ultimately to China and India, and thereby buy the spices and luxury goods that the Europeans so much desired. So there is this sort of Portuguese empire in Asia, but there's also a Spanish connection as well. Are there any questions about what I've said up to this point?
Professor, sorry, you said it was
pressing onward. What I want to do now is make a very important point.
Professor.
We saw that Portugal,
Professor.
of course, the Portuguese Empire, it was a merchant empire, but the Portuguese monarchy was the reference point. Without the backing of the Portuguese monarchy, these merchants could not operate. Well, in Spain, the merchant class, like in Portugal, it was not highly developed. And as a matter of fact, the dominant element were the Jews, and of which there were several 100,000 in Spain, maybe almost close to 1 million Jews in Spain. Well, this was the most of the middle class. There were some Spanish merchants as well, but I would say the merchant class was especially in Castile, which is a central part of Spain, Madrid, and there's Portugal to the west. Castile sits at the center, and off to the right is a little kingdom known as Aragon. Well, what we should say is that in 1469, Spain came into existence. Up until then, no united Spanish monarchy existed. It was the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1469, which united these two parts of Spain, Castile and Aragon, into a single monarchy. This was the unification of Spain. And I want to describe the consolidation of the Spanish state, because the development of Latin America was dependent on the backing of the Spanish state. Plus, Spain in its own right in Europe became the dominant military and political power during the 16th and 17th century. So it's important to understand this process of state unification in Spain in the course of in the reign of Ferdinand Isabella, which basically the date is basically from 1469 to around the beginning of the 16th century, for the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, the most important characteristic of this Spanish society is that it, like Portugal in a way, had emerged by crusading against the Arabs. Because you should understand that throughout much of the Middle Ages, it was the Arabs who ruled Spain. From their capital in Spain, it was in the south, and it was called the Kingdom of Granada. The Kingdom of Granada. You can go see this as a tourist, and it's magnificent. The Arab Kingdom of Granada. Well, the Spanish people, they emerged. This, of course, was a militant Roman Catholic crusading movement. The Spanish Catholicism advance at the expense of these Arabs. And so that this kind of crusading Roman Catholicism is the basic ideology of the Roman Catholic state, of the Spanish state. Now, let's examine this process of state consolidation. Now, Spain, when in the course of the 15th century, this is before Ferdinand and Isabella, was very troubled. There were wars against the Muslims, of course, but within Spain, the dominant class in the parts of Spain that the Christians occupied were not the merchants, it was the crusading nobility, the landed class, feudal warriors. Basically, they were the ruling class in Spain, especially in Castile. And this was a large country. Castile alone had about 11 million people. Most of these people were peasants, but they lived under the dominance of this landlord class. Now, in the 15th century, this class the monarchy was quite weak, the monarchies in Aragon and Castile. And this landed aristocracy, their pleasure was fighting the Muslims, but also fighting amongst themselves. A kind of generalized anarchy existed in Spain because of the civil wars between these landed aristocracy. And of course, the rest of the people were terrified. The peasants and such merchants there were terrified. And what happens under Ferdinand and Isabella is a vast consolidation of the royal power. The landed aristocracy, whether they like it or not, are gradually brought under the control of the Spanish monarchy. And basically, this is how it was done. First of all, amongst this landed aristocracy, the most militant crusaders were what we call the military orders. There were three great military orders, and if you could believe it, these people, these crusading orders, they were monks. They were prohibited from having sexual relations, and they dedicated all their energies to a combination of a sort of constant prayer and killing Arabs. That was what they did. And in the course of these Middle Ages, these monastic orders had become, there were three of them, had become fabulously rich. They had become rich. They had vast lands and treasures. So Ferdinand, the first thing he does, he declares that I am now the chief of these three military orders. In other words, all of the armed personnel, all of the treasure, all of the land that these orders have now become basically state property under Ferdinand. So that in itself gives the monarchy a great power. Secondly, in the 1470s, Ferdinand and Isabella enter into negotiations with the popes in Rome. And they tell the Pope, of course, we are fervent Roman Catholics. We're going to fight the Arabs, and we're going to get rid of our Jews for good measure. But we need power. And so this is the deal. And the Pope agrees. The Pope concedes that all of the property of the Catholic Church in Spain and all of the leading officials, the bishops, the big abbots, they are all now going to be controlled by Ferdinand and Isabella. the church as a political and economic entity becomes basically an instrument of the Spanish monarchy, which gives the monarchy an enormous second reinforcement of power. And for good measure, the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, arrange that a special Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, will be created. In 1479, the Spanish Inquisition is created. And this is a special court. And what is its purpose? It is to deal with the subversive Jewish and Muslim population in Spain, to terrify them into becoming Roman Catholics. And this institution, as a matter of fact, the Spanish Inquisition, becomes the only, in terms of Aragon on Castile, it's the first institution which unites the two parts of the Spanish monarchy. The Spanish Inquisition is the first Spanish national institution, the Inquisition. So what I'm basically saying is that yes, the monarchy gets this enormous power, but the ideological control by means of kind of a terror court is enormously increased. And it's increased at the expense of the Muslim and Jews, but even the Christian population of Spain becomes terrified by the Spanish Inquisition. To be brought before this Inquisition is a horrible fate. And so this gives ideological control to the Spanish monarchy. Now, on this basis, then, the crown also intimidates the merchants, because up to this point, the towns in Spain, and the word town, had been self-governing. That's canceled. Royal officials are installed as the head of all the municipal governments in Spain. And lastly, the Spanish crown establishes a sales tax. Every sale or purchase from now on, you have to pay a tax to the crown, which gives us a stream of revenue, and so on. Finally, in 1492, a big event, the dispatch of Columbus to the New World. But it's in that year, 1492, that the Jews are told, convert or get out. Most of them leave. Some of them secretly continue to try and hold on to their faith, so-called converso. But at the same time, 1492, the final war against the Muslims, the final war against the Kingdom of Granada, and the Ferdinand and Isabella assemble a huge army to basically lay siege and conquer the last bastion of the Arabs in Spain, in southern Spain. You could visit Granada today. In any case, in the course of basically conducting this campaign against Granada, they create a great army which becomes, on the basis of the new revenues available, a standing Spanish army. And the basic unit of this army were the tercios. And this is a absolutely unprecedented army, because during the Middle Ages, the landlord class, the feudal class, it was cavalry, which was the main arm of warfare. But no, the Spanish army is based on the infantry. The basic units of the Spanish army are the so-called tercio regiments. And they're made up largely of peasants, but their captains are the nobles. If you want to be a successful noble from this point onward, you have to join the Spanish army. You become a captain in the Spanish infantry regiments. And these Spanish army, the main instrument of war is the rifle, which is a new weapon. Cavalry loses its place. And the Spanish infantry becomes the model for standing armies all over Europe. We'll see that's true of France, and it's true of other states as well. Well, when you combine, in addition to finally to this, of course, the Spanish court is setting up a tax bureaucracy, a judicial bureaucracy, courts. In Madrid, they create a royal court. The king is surrounded by bureaucrats, and the highest nobility are to be found around the king and the queen in Madrid. So when you combine all these things together, the taking over the military orders, the seizure of state property, establishment of the Inquisition, the establishment of the standing army, the creation of a bureaucracy, the establishment of a royal court in Madrid. This is the consolidation of the Spanish state. And this state is the backing for the conquest of the New World, which, lo and behold, immediately discovers vast amounts of gold and silver. And this only reinforces the enormous political power of the Spanish state. So Spain emerges at the beginning of the 16th century as the most important power in Europe, the most important power in Europe. Well, I'll continue this discussion in the
Professor?
next class.
Professor,
Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor, Professor.